In the world of eagle's flight, the rise of the German Empire was not universally welcomed. While Kaiser Wilhelm IV's leadership appeared to be committed to peace, there were factions within the Allies, particularly in France, Britain and Poland, that viewed Germany's resurgence with deep suspicion and concern. In Britain, a gentleman named Winston Churchill was one of the most vocal critics of Germany's rise. Churchill, a seasoned statesman and a fierce patriot, was deeply distrustful of Germany's intentions. He saw in its growing navy and industrial might a direct challenge to the British Empire. He believed that Germany, regardless of its peaceful rhetoric, was a threat that needed to be countered. Churchill's views were not shared by all, however. Neville Chamberlain, who remained in office as Prime Minister in 1940, was more conciliatory towards Germany. Chamberlain's approach was one of uneasy alliance and peace. He believed that a strong and prosperous Germany could be a stabilizing force in Europe, a counterweight to the growing threat of Stalin's Soviet Union. He sought to engage with Germany, to build bridges rather than walls. Yet the divisions within the Allies were deep and growing. There were those who, like Churchill, believed that Germany's rise needed to be checked. They saw in Germany's industrial and military might a threat to the balance of power in Europe. They feared that if left unchecked, Germany could once again plunge the continent into war. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, sought to secure peace by brokering a deal that would allow Germany to reunite with Sudetenland. This move, however, was not without controversy. Chamberlain's decision was met with fierce opposition from a faction within the British elite, led by Winston Churchill. They saw this as an appeasement of German expansionism, a dangerous precedent that would only embolden Kaiser Wilhelm IV. They argued that Germany should be kept in check, not uplifted. Kaiser Wilhelm IV, for his part, sought to ensure a peaceful transition. He offered a substantial compensation to the Czechoslovak government in exchange for Sudetenland. This gesture, while generous, did not alleviate the sense of loss and resentment among many Czechs. The pressure from Chamberlain and the United States, who supported a peaceful solution to the Sudetenland issue, eventually led to the Czechoslovak government caving in to Germany's demands. This decision, however, was not well received by Czech nationalists. They saw it as a betrayal, a surrender to German pressure. In the summer of 1940, when Germany peacefully annexed Sudetenland, the situation in Czechoslovakia reached a boiling point. The government in Prague was overthrown in a coup led by nationalists and military officers. They declared the annexation illegal and called on the League of Nations, or Volkerbund, to intervene. The Volkerbund, however, remained silent on the issue. They cited the ethnically German population of Sudetenland as a somewhat valid reason for Germany's annexation. This decision, while pragmatic, was seen by many as a failure of the international community to stand up to German expansionism. Churchill and his faction, naturally, supported the new military government in Prague. They backed up their nationalist stance on Sudetenland and condemned the Volkerbund's inaction. This further deepened the divisions within the Allies and added another layer of complexity to the already tense situation in Europe. Churchill's opposition to Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement was fierce and unrelenting. He saw in Chamberlain's concessions to Germany a dangerous naivety, a failure to recognise the true nature of the German threat. He believed that Chamberlain's policy was not just misguided, but detrimental to Britain's interests and security. To this end, Churchill spearheaded a smear campaign against Chamberlain and his government. He used his influence in the media and his connections in the political elite to spread his message. He painted Chamberlain as a weak and indecisive leader, a man who was willing to sacrifice Britain's interests for the sake of peace. Churchill's speeches were filled with fiery rhetoric and dire warnings. He spoke of the dangers of appeasement, of the threat posed by a resurgent Germany, and of the need for Britain to stand firm. He painted a picture of a future where Britain, under Chamberlain's leadership, would be at the mercy of a powerful and aggressive Germany. This smear campaign was not without its effects. It sowed doubt and discord within the British government and the public. It put pressure on Chamberlain and his allies, forcing them to defend their policies and their leadership. As the German forces advanced through the Sudetenland, they were greeted with jubilation by the local German population. Years of separation had fostered a deep longing for reunion with Greater Germany. and the sight of German soldiers marching through their streets was seen as the realization of that dream. Everywhere they went, the troops were hailed as heroes, with crowds lining the streets, waving flags and singing patriotic songs. The atmosphere was one of celebration and relief, as the people of Sudetenland praised their return to the fold of the Reich and expressed their deep appreciation for the German Empire's efforts to bring them back into its embrace. In this world of eagle's flight, the reunion of Sudetenland with Greater Germany was not just a political or military achievement, but a deeply emotional and symbolic moment for its people. While the German forces marched triumphantly through the streets of Sudetenland, they were met with an unexpected sight. Members of the National Front Party, a faction known for its ultra-nationalist views within the German Empire, greeted the soldiers with the Roman greeting, a fascist salute that had not been commonly seen in the more enlightened empire of Kaiser Wilhelm IV. This gesture was a stark departure from the usual receptions German troops had received in other regions. The sight of the salute was a somewhat tense and foreboding moment. It was a clear indication that the influence of the ultra-nationalists in Germany was on the rise. Their sentiments, which had been simmering beneath the surface, were now becoming more overt, fueled by the aggressive postures of nations like Britain and the Soviet Union. These countries, wary of Germany's growing might, had been engaging in a form of diplomacy that was increasingly confrontational. Poland, sharing a border with Germany and having historical tensions, found itself in an especially precarious position. The rapid expansion and assertiveness of the German Empire were sources of great concern for the Polish leadership. They couldn't merely stand by and watch as Germany's power and influence grew unchecked. By mid-July 1940, sensing the shifting sands of geopolitics and the potential threat from its powerful neighbour, Poland declared a general mobilization. In the wake of Germany's annexation of Sudetenland, Neville Chamberlain found himself in the eye of a political storm. Churchill's smear campaign against him was relentless and effective. Using his oratory skills and influence in the media, Churchill painted Chamberlain as a weak leader who had capitulated to German demands, betraying Czechoslovakia in the process. The narrative took hold. In the eyes of the British public, Chamberlain was increasingly seen as a coward who had not only failed to stand up to Berlin, but had actively facilitated the expansion of what many still viewed as Britain's archenemy in Europe. The memories of past conflicts with Germany were still fresh in the minds of many, and Churchill played on these sentiments masterfully. The pressure on Chamberlain grew day by day. Protests, editorials, and public opinion turned against him. The once respected leader was now being portrayed as a traitor to European stability and British interests. By August 1940, the weight of public opinion and political pressure became too much for Chamberlain to bear. He stepped down as Prime Minister, his reputation tarnished and his legacy in question. To no one's surprise, the man who had been his most vocal critic, Winston Churchill, stepped into the role of Prime Minister. Churchill's rise to power was seen by many as a necessary change in leadership, a shift towards a more assertive and confrontational stance against the growing might of the German Empire. Meanwhile, the situation in the Korridor and around Danzig was a powder keg waiting to explode. The British, wary of the German Empire's expansion and influence, had promised Poland military aid should Germany ever attack. This assurance emboldened certain factions within Poland, particularly the nationalist militias. These militias, driven by a fervent sense of nationalism and a desire to assert Polish dominance in the region, began a series of aggressive actions against the German communities in the Korridor and around Danzig. Villages were torched, properties vandalized, and German civilians were often caught in the crossfire. The British government, despite being aware of these provocations, chose to turn a blind eye, viewing it as a countermeasure to German expansionism. The German nationalists, outraged by the attacks on their kin, retaliated in kind. Polish villages were targeted, leading to a vicious cycle of violence and retribution. The situation was spiralling out of control, with both sides committing atrocities and the civilian populace living in constant fear. Calls for intervention grew louder within the German communities affected by the violence. They implored Berlin to take decisive action, to protect them, and to reclaim Danzig and other historically contested regions. The sentiment was not just about territorial claims, it was a cry for safety, identity, and recognition. However, Kaiser Wilhelm IV, ever the pragmatic leader, was deeply concerned about the implications of a direct military intervention. He recognized that such a move would not only escalate the situation locally, but could also draw other European powers into the conflict, potentially leading to a much larger and devastating war. The memories of World War I were still fresh, and the Kaiser was acutely aware of the costs of such a conflict.